Iran is one of the richest countries in oil on earth. Yet right now, in January 2026, its people are in the streets protesting because they can't afford food. This is a nation sitting on the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves and second largest natural gas reserves. Wealth beneath the ground that should make every Iranian citizen prosperous. Instead, the currency is collapsing, inflation is out of control, and young people are risking their lives in protests that have been building for years. So where did all the money go? And why does Iran's economy keep breaking no matter what the government tries? Welcome back to Past to Profit, where history meets money. Iran should not be poor. Let's establish that right from the start. This is a country of 88 million people with massive natural resources, a highly educated population, and a strategic location connecting Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Before 1979, Iran had a growing middle class, modern infrastructure, and was integrated into the global economy. Tehran looked like any major modern city. Iranian professionals worked internationally. The country exported oil and used the revenue to build industries, universities, and a modern state. But that was almost 50 years ago, and the Iran of today bears little resemblance to that promise. To understand why, you need to understand what happened in 1979, and how every economic problem Iran faces today traces back to decisions made in the revolution and the years that followed. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was one of the most significant political upheavals of the 20th century. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had ruled Iran since 1941 with strong backing from the United States and Britain, was overthrown by a popular uprising that united students, workers, religious conservatives, and leftists. The revolution was driven by anger over corruption, authoritarian rule, economic inequality, and foreign influence, particularly American influence over Iran's oil and politics. When the Shah fell and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini took power, Iran transformed from a secular monarchy aligned with the West into an Islamic republic governed by religious law. The new government nationalized industries, expelled foreign companies, and restructured the economy according to ideological principles rather than market efficiency. Power became concentrated in two overlapping structures: the government, which has elected elements but limited real authority, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps known as the IRGC, which controls vast sections of the economy and operates as a state within a state. This is where Iran's economic problems begin. The revolution didn't just change who governed, it changed the fundamental structure of how the economy operated. Industries that had been privately owned or operated by foreign companies were seized and put under control of revolutionary foundations, the IRGC, or government ministries. Competence and efficiency became secondary to loyalty and ideological alignment. The economy shifted from being market-driven, where businesses competed and adapted to consumer needs, to being state and ideology-driven, where political considerations dictated economic decisions. Then came the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988. This was a catastrophic conflict that killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians, destroyed infrastructure, and drained the country's resources for nearly a decade. The war left Iran isolated internationally, economically devastated, and deeply suspicious of outside powers. It also entrenched the power of the IRGC, which expanded from a military force into an economic empire during and after the war. But the single biggest factor strangling Iran's economy isn't internal, it's external: sanctions. And to understand Iran's financial crisis, you need to understand how sanctions work and why they're so devastating. Sanctions against Iran come in waves, each building on the previous ones, creating layers of economic restriction that make normal commerce nearly impossible. The first major sanctions came after the revolution, when Iranian students seized the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. The US froze Iranian assets and imposed trade restrictions. Those sanctions were eased somewhat in the 1990s, but they never fully went away. The next major escalation came in the 2000s, when evidence emerged that Iran was developing nuclear technology that could potentially be used for weapons. The United States, European Union, and United Nations all imposed sanctions targeting Iran's nuclear program, its banks, its oil exports, and any companies doing business with Iran. These weren't just trade restrictions, they were designed to cut Iran off from the global financial system entirely. Here's how it works in practice. Iran can produce oil, one of the most valuable commodities on earth, but selling that oil and getting paid for it is extraordinarily difficult. International banks won't process transactions involving Iran because they risk being cut off from the US financial system themselves. The SWIFT network, which banks use to transfer money internationally, expelled Iranian banks under pressure from the US and Europe. This means even when Iran finds buyers for its oil, often China or other countries willing to skirt sanctions, getting paid is complicated and costly. Iran has to use workarounds. Barter deals, cryptocurrency, shell companies, smuggling cash physically across borders. Every transaction that would normally take minutes through a bank transfer becomes a complex operation involving middlemen, fees, and risk. Even when Iran gets paid, the money often can't be freely converted or moved. Billions of dollars in Iranian oil revenue are frozen in accounts in countries like South Korea and Iraq. Technically Iran's money, but inaccessible because of sanctions. Foreign companies that once operated in Iran have almost all left. European car manufacturers, technology companies, international banks, they all pulled out rather than risk US sanctions. This leaves Iran cut off from global supply chains, unable to import advanced technology, spare parts, or even basic consumer goods easily. The result is an economy that's isolated, inefficient, and starved of the foreign investment and expertise it needs to modernize. In 2015, there was hope. Iran negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the JCPOA or the Iran Nuclear Deal, with the United States, Europe, Russia, and China. Iran agreed to strict limits on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. For a brief period, it looked like Iran might reintegrate into the global economy. Oil exports increased. Foreign companies started exploring opportunities. The Iranian Rial stabilized somewhat. Then in 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the deal and reimposed sanctions, even harsher than before. European companies that had returned to Iran fled again, terrified of being cut off from American markets. Iran's oil exports, which had recovered to over 2 million barrels per day, crashed back down to under 500,000. The economic opening collapsed, and with it, any hope for short-term recovery. The Biden administration signaled willingness to renegotiate, but talks stalled over Iranian demands and domestic political opposition in both countries. Now in 2026, as Iran faces some of its worst unrest in years, sanctions remain fully in place with no resolution in sight. The economic stranglehold continues, and ordinary Iranians are the ones suffering most. This brings us to the currency collapse and inflation, which is where economic policy failures become visible in everyday life. The Iranian rial has lost over 99% of its value against the dollar since the revolution. In 1979, the exchange rate was roughly 70 rials to $1. Today, in January 2026, it's over 600,000 rials to $1 on the open market. Though the government maintains a fictional official rate that no one actually uses. This isn't just an abstract number. This is people's savings evaporating. When the rial loses value, everything imported becomes more expensive, and Iran imports a lot. Food, medicine, electronics, industrial equipment. Prices rise constantly, month after month, year after year. Inflation in Iran has regularly exceeded 30 or 40% annually, and during crisis periods, it spiked much higher. Imagine trying to plan a life in that environment. You save money for a year to buy a car, and by the time you have enough, the price has doubled. You budget for groceries, and next month the same items cost 50% more. Salaries are denominated in rials, so even when the government raises wages, inflation eats the increase immediately. People's standard of living declines year after year, not because they're lazy or unproductive, but because the currency they're paid in is dying. The government tries to control prices through subsidies and official exchange rates, but this only creates black markets and corruption. If the official rate is 100,000 rials to the dollar, but the real market rate is 600,000, anyone with access to dollars at the official rate can make a huge profit by selling them on the black market. This privilege goes to those with connections, government officials, IRGC members, people close to power. Ordinary citizens can't access these deals. They pay market prices for everything, while elites profit from arbitrage. The IRGC's economic role deserves special attention because it's central to understanding why Iran's economy is so dysfunctional. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was created after the revolution as a military force loyal to the new Islamic Republic, separate from the regular army. Over the decades, it evolved into something far more than a military organization. It became an economic empire controlling an estimated 30 to 50% of Iran's entire economy. The IRGC owns construction companies that build infrastructure projects. It controls ports and smuggling networks. It runs telecommunications companies. It has fingers in oil, gas, and petrochemicals. It operates foundations that are officially charitable but function as massive business conglomerates. And all of this operates with minimal transparency, oversight, or accountability. When the government awards a major contract, it often goes to an IRGC-connected company, not through competitive bidding, but through political connections. When sanctions force foreign companies out, IRGC entities fill the vacuum, often inefficiently and at inflated prices. The profits from all this activity don't flow to the Iranian state budget to be spent on schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. They stay within the IRGC network, enriching commanders and funding the organization's military and political activities. This creates a system where connections matter more than competence. If you want to start a business in Iran, success often depends not on your business plan or skills, but on whether you have the right relationships with the right people. If you don't, you'll face arbitrary regulations, competitors with political backing, and barriers that make success nearly impossible. This stifles entrepreneurship, discourages innovation, and pushes talented people to give up or leave the country entirely. Which brings us to one of Iran's most tragic economic problems: brain drain and youth unemployment. Iran has a young population with around 60% under 30 years old. This should be an economic advantage, a large workforce ready to drive growth and innovation. Iran also has a highly educated population. Literacy rates are high. Universities produce engineers, doctors, scientists, and business professionals, but there are no jobs for them. Youth unemployment in Iran is estimated at around 25 to 30%, and that likely an undercount because it doesn't include people who've given up looking for work or are underemployed in jobs that don't match their skills. A young person graduates with an engineering degree and finds there are no engineering jobs, or the jobs that exist pay so little that it's not worth taking them. Salaries are in Rials, which are constantly losing value. Benefits are minimal. Opportunities for advancement are limited unless you have connections, so they leave. Hundreds of thousands of educated Iranians have emigrated over the past decades, moving to Europe, North America, Australia, anywhere that offers stability and opportunity. This brain drain represents a massive loss of human capital. These are exactly the people Iran needs to build a modern economy, and they're fleeing because the system gives them no reason to stay. Those who remain often feel trapped. They see their friends leaving for better lives abroad. They watch their own prospects dimming as the economy stagnates and the political system offers no path for change. This frustration, this sense of having no future in your own country, is a huge part of why protests keep erupting in Iran. Economic pain becomes political anger, and that anger has been exploding into the streets regularly for years now. The current protests in January 2026 are not new. They're the latest wave in a cycle that's been repeating since at least 2017. And they always follow the same pattern. The government, facing budget deficits and unable to sustain subsidies on fuel, bread, and other basic goods, announces cuts or price increases. These subsidies have existed since the revolution and are seen as part of the social contract. The government provides cheap fuel and food, and the population tolerates the regime. When subsidies are cut, prices jump overnight. Gasoline that cost almost nothing suddenly costs real money. Bread prices double or triple. For people already struggling, this is the breaking point. Protests erupt, usually starting over economic grievances but quickly expanding to broader political demands. People chant not just about prices, but about corruption, about freedom, about the government itself. In 2017, protests began in Mashhad over economic issues and spread nationwide. In 2019, fuel price increases triggered the deadliest protests in decades, with hundreds killed. In 2022, the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody sparked months of protests that were as much about women's rights and political freedom as they were about economics. Now in January 2026, Iran is facing another wave of unrest. The immediate trigger, as in past cycles, is economic. The Rial has hit new lows against the dollar. Inflation is soaring again. The government, desperate for revenue, has cut subsidies on essential goods. Prices have spiked, and people who were already barely surviving are being pushed into desperation. But this time, the protests feel different. There's a deeper anger, a sense that the system itself is irredeemable. The government's response follows a familiar playbook. First, they shut down the internet or severely restrict it, cutting off protesters' ability to organize and communicate with the outside world. Then come the crackdowns. Security forces, often IRGC units or Basij militia, move into the streets. Tear gas, rubber bullets, sometimes live ammunition. Arrests by the thousands. Protesters disappear into detention centers. Some are released after days or weeks. Others face charges of threatening national security, which can carry heavy prison sentences or even execution. This repression works in the short term. Protests are suppressed. The streets go quiet. But it doesn't solve any of the underlying problems. The economy is still broken. Sanctions are still in place. Corruption is still rampant. Trust between the people and the state remains shattered. And so the cycle repeats. Economic pain leads to protest. Protest leads to repression. Repression leads to more anger, and the pressure builds until it explodes again. Why do the protests keep coming back? Because nothing fundamental ever changes. Each wave of protest is put down, and then the government returns to the same policies that caused the crisis. Sanctions relief remains out of reach because Iran won't make the concessions on its nuclear program and regional activities that the West demands. And the West won't ease sanctions without those concessions. Meanwhile, the internal power structure, the control of the IRGC, the corruption, the lack of accountability, all of that remains untouched, because reforming it would threaten the very people who hold power. The Iranian people see this clearly. They know the government is not going to voluntarily reform itself. They know that as long as the current system is in place, the economy will continue to fail them. And they know that protest is dangerous, that people die, that speaking out can cost you your freedom or your life. But they also know that staying silent means accepting a future of poverty and stagnation while elites grow richer. So they protest anyway, even knowing the risks, because what other choice do they have? So the question everyone asks is, can Iran fix its economy? And the honest answer is that it depends on who you ask and what you mean by fix. There are essentially three possible scenarios for Iran's economic future, and none of them are easy or certain. Scenario 1. Sanctions ease, and Iran experiences a slow recovery. This would require some kind of diplomatic breakthrough, either a revival of the nuclear deal or a new agreement that satisfies both Iran and the West. If sanctions were lifted, Iran could sell oil normally again, access the international banking system, and attract foreign investment. Oil revenue would flow properly, hard currency would stabilize the Rial, and inflation would gradually come under control. The economy wouldn't boom overnight. Decades of mismanagement and isolation can't be undone quickly, but there would at least be a path toward improvement. The problem with this scenario is that it requires compromise, and neither side seems willing to make the necessary concessions. Iran wants sanctions lifted first, then it will negotiate limits on its nuclear program. The West wants Iran to limit its nuclear program first, then sanctions will be eased. Neither side trusts the other, and domestic politics in both Iran and the United States make compromise politically toxic. So while this scenario is theoretically possible, it seems unlikely in the near term. Scenario 2. The status quo continues and Iran's economy keeps slowly declining. Sanctions remain. The IRGC maintains its economic control. Corruption continues. Inflation grinds on. The Rial keeps losing value. More young people leave the country. Protests erupt periodically and are suppressed. This is arguably what's been happening for the past decade, and it could continue for years or even decades more. Iran wouldn't collapse entirely. It would just muddle through in a state of permanent crisis, with the population growing poorer and angrier while the elite class insulates itself from the pain. This scenario is perhaps the most likely, simply because it's the path of least resistance. It doesn't require anyone to make hard choices or take risks. The government can keep blaming sanctions for everything. The West can keep pointing to Iran's nuclear program and regional activities as justification for sanctions. And ordinary Iranians keep suffering while the system grinds on. Scenario 3. Internal reform driven by pressure from below. This is the hardest scenario, but potentially the most transformative. It would require fundamental changes to how power operates in Iran, breaking the IRGC's economic monopoly, establishing real transparency and accountability, moving toward a system where economic decisions are made based on efficiency rather than political loyalty, and creating space for genuine private enterprise and competition. This kind of reform would face massive resistance from those who benefit from the current system. The IRGC is not going to voluntarily give up its economic empire. Government officials who profit from corruption won't support transparency. And the political structure of the Islamic Republic, where unelected clerical bodies hold ultimate power, is designed specifically to prevent this kind of bottom-up change. For this scenario to happen, it would likely require sustained pressure from the population, the kind of pressure we're seeing in the protests of 2026, combined with splits within the elite where some faction decides that limited reform is necessary to preserve the system itself. Historically, this is how authoritarian regimes sometimes evolve, when the costs of repression become too high and the benefits of limited opening become attractive, even to those in power. But this is speculation. The reality is that Iran's economic crisis is fundamentally a political crisis. The country has resources. It has educated people. It has strategic location and potential. What it doesn't have is a system that uses those advantages effectively. And until Iran fixes how power operates, how decisions are made, and who benefits from economic activity, its economy will keep punishing its people. The protests in January 2026 are not just about fuel prices or inflation. They're about a population that's been pushed to the breaking point by decades of economic mismanagement, corruption, and policies that serve the interests of a narrow elite while everyone else suffers. This isn't one protest, it's years of accumulated pressure finding release. Iran's problem isn't lack of money. It's how power controls that money who benefits from it, and what choices the government makes in managing the economy. Until those fundamental issues change, the cycle will continue. Economic pain will lead to protest. Protest will lead to repression. Repression will build more anger, and the whole thing will repeat. The question isn't whether Iran will face another economic crisis and another wave of protests. The question is whether anything will be different the next time, or whether the cycle will just continue until something finally breaks that can't be put back together. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and on Past to Profit, we'll show you where to look.